Hello, today I'm going to talk about something for horror and weird fiction authors that is possibly more important nowadays or more relevant, certainly for the last 5 years, maybe over a decade, and that is how to write folk horror, stories that are inspired by marginalized traditions without appropriating or exploiting those cultures. And as you can see, there's a lot more content coming out now with that theme. And folk horror draws on deep cultural histories, stories that are often born in trauma or resistance, certainly community. And it becomes problematic, I think, where you have a beginner writer or somebody who is culturally ignorant, or let's say culturally naive. The problem when they represent these communities, there's a danger of them making a big misstep. There's a risk of producing a story where the culture gets reduced to an exotic prop, or ripped from its context by somebody who's not from that culture. And so I want to explain why inclusion and ethical practice are vital for our genre's integrity and for its power, you know. I'm going to be using some examples to give you an idea, but also I'm going to give a brief example of a flash fiction piece I wrote, which can show you how creating something completely new avoids all those traps. So, folk horror, what do we need to do? Folk horror is the literature of thresholds, of standing where the known world ends and staring into the dark tangle beyond. It's the domain of ancient stones and muttered charms, of isolated communities and customs older than memory. And it lures us because it feels true, that the land remembers, that the past can reach out and take hold of us. But writing folk horror also means writing the other, the stranger, the outsider, the people or their practices that feel alien. And that, in the wrong hands, can become a prop for fear, or rather a mere prop for fear. Do you want to write folk horror that unnerves, that haunts, that conjures up the strange without disrespecting it? Yes. So, let's see how stories of land and loss and dread serve horror, not prejudice. I'm going to refer to the following texts in this video: The Willows by Algernon and Blackwood, The Withered Arm by Thomas Hardy, The Summer People by Shirley Jackson, In the Hills, the Cities by Clive Barker, The Blair Witch Project, Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse, and one of my own called The Rise of Woman. Why is folk horror drawn to the other, to the strange community, the hidden custom, the land that doesn't play by our rules? Because folk horror begins with trespass. The protagonist crosses a boundary, a literal one, into an unfamiliar place, or a moral one by the violation of custom or history or nature. In The Willows, two men's casual journey down the Danube becomes a slow unraveling as the river islands close around them with a sentience that is beyond reason. In The Summer People, a city couple stays beyond their welcome in rural America, and they find the neighborly masks slipping. The Withered Arm by Thomas Hardy, full of suspicion, isolation, and there's a superstition tangle, and it all comes together with tragic results. The other in folk horror isn't always people, it's place, it's belief. But too often, stories make the leap from the place is strange to the people are dangerous, and that's where the harm begins. Folk horror risks falling into harmful patterns, and we as writers must guard against them. I wanted to mention one that succeeds in everything, but I think it still might walk a dangerous line. And if I'm honest, it's one of my favourite properties. But the Blair Witch Project presented its story as if it came from authentic oral tradition, borrowing the style and feel of real regional myths. And by doing that, people claimed it benefited from the cultural weight of real folklore to make its horror feel authentic and immersive, but that because the legend is fabricated, it dodges responsibility for representing any specific group, whilst still profiting from that aesthetic. And that can be seen as a kind of folklore appropriation, using the surface feel of a culture's traditions without engaging or respecting its depth, its context, or its real-world struggles. To that end, I think witches are so ingrained in so many cultures and intersectional creations themselves. They kind of belong to everyone, don't they? I mean, if we're going to be picky, in the Blair Witch Project, the witch is little more than a bogey woman, a cipher to hang our fear of the wild on, or whatever. There's no voice, no real history, there's no deep sense of the why behind her rage. And the community of Burkittsville is somewhat implied as being complicit, but there's no real complexity there either. So people could complain about the representation of Appalachian culture, real Appalachian culture, but I'd have to wonder if the argument lands more on the academic side there than one which deals with someone or something any minority actually experienced. Perhaps it was fueled by the reaction the film had, such an emotive reaction. People were divided even though it was largely held as a masterpiece in horror. And look, it heralded a legacy in found footage we still see going strong today. It was ahead of the curve as well, insofar as the way society now records and represents truth and lifestyle by social media individuals and influence and so on. For me, the Blair Witch Project is an outstanding achievement, and to the point of on the community being too loosely drawn and the witch being a simple cipher, please check out the Blair Witch Dossier. It's a book by David A. Stern. It's a wonderful presentation of canon backstory, and it uses a pseudo-ergodic approach. And things are in the form of newspaper excerpts, police files, journal entries, and that kind of stuff. So, moving on from the Blair Witch Project. The danger arises when we lift charms, rituals, or beliefs from real cultures, often marginalized, and use them as our props. You see it in lazy depictions of Romany curses, of West African rites twisted into voodoo/hoodoo stereotypes, of indigenous customs mined for spooky material. The Withered Arm at least shows characters trapped by their society's expectation. Not just villains lurking in the hedgerows, but too many folk horror stories reduce rural or isolated people to mindless cultists driven by a bloodlust or a hate of outsiders. How often have we seen the strange community given no voice at all? They exist only as a threat. Their beliefs are never articulated. Their humanity is erased. But folk horror can confront fear of the other sensitively and safely. In The Lighthouse, Egger's protagonists aren't tormented by villagers or ancient cults. Their isolation, their guilt, their lust and rivalry are their undoing. The land, the sea, the light itself, they are almost sentient. But there's no human culture there that's mocked or appropriated. In The Hills, The Cities, a short story by Clive Barker, that offers horror on a cosmic scale with thousands of villagers fused into walking giants. But Barker's story, it remains anchored in human voices, human choices, and human flaws. The villagers aren't mindless monsters, by the way. They're part of something terrifying and sublime. In The Rise of Woman, I created a wholly original myth, an island that appears off Lyme Regis, an ancient prophecy, a buried woman who rises. No real culture's sacred beliefs were mined for terror. And in fact, it's more a feminist piece and a comment on the patriarchy. Shirley Jackson's The Summer People, that gives us rural Americans who are quietly, chillingly hostile. But Jackson lets their menace emerge slowly, ambiguously. We don't know their motives, we just see their civility curdle, not their humanity being erased. If you're inspired by a real tradition, do the research, consult people of that culture, get sensitivity readers. Horror gains power through its authenticity, not through its use of stereotypes. So really do your work. And that's one of the main themes in all of these videos, is do your work. At the heart of folk horror is power. The power of the land over those who walk it, the power of custom and belief over the living, and the power we hold as writers to shape readers' visions of the other. So ask yourself, are you writing from curiosity, or from fear or fetishization of what you don't understand? Are you making the marginalized threat because that's easy shorthand? Or are you imagining a community with complexity, or a mob with torches? In The Rise of Woman, terror comes not from a living community, but from history, from the consequences of erasure, of hubris, of disturbing what should have been left in peace. The men who land on the island bring about their own doom. They trespass, they dig, they violate. The other isn't demonized. The other is what was silenced. And that's a key lesson for folk horror. The most haunting stories aren't those that demonize the other, but those that reveal what was hidden, what was wronged, and what is returning. So what can you do? These are my practical steps for writing folk horror that should let you respect its provenance or heritage, whilst at the same time evoking a sense of terror. Build your own myths. Build your own customs and rites. We're creators of worlds, aren't we, as authors? If you're inspired by a real culture, do the work. Research the hell out of it. See if you can consult those who have real lived experiences of that tradition. Respect it. Respect them. Let your strange communities have depth. Give them reason and an authentic belief. Let them speak. Let them be human too. Think, are you telling the story of a people or of the outsider's fear? Are you reducing an entire culture to a backdrop or a side dish just for your protagonist's terror? Another one, I'm going to call this punching down, but that phrase in itself implies a lower status, so let's just call it low-hanging fruit. That is to say, don't make poverty, rurality, or any kind of marginalization the easy shorthand for menace. Let the dread come from guilt, grief, from loss, from isolation, fears we all share, the things that link with the shared characteristics of the human condition. That is where you can find horror in the universal. It's important that you get this verified. Sensitivity readers, beta readers, consultation, as I said earlier, when you're doing your research, all these are tools that'll make your work stronger, not weaker. If you spend all your time doing research and not getting feedback when you've actually written the story, how will you know what missteps you might have made? There may be gaps or assumptions in your presentation of them, no matter how careful you've been. We don't know what we don't know, so this is a process for you. And that's the last piece of advice. Take this as an ongoing process. We can always learn more, especially in the representation of the marginalized in horror and weird fiction. So folk horror is really fertile ground. It's really rich soil for us writers, but the roots in that ground are tangled, and they're tangled in history, and they're tangled in prejudice, but most of all, they're tangled in people's lives, real lived experiences. So write with care. Let your stories unsettle people, disturb them, aim to terrify, don't aim to cause actual harm, because your fiction should reveal the uncanny, not just be casting stones at something because it feels unfamiliar in a modern setting. Next time, I'm going to talk about writing the neurodivergent in horror and how we avoid dehumanizing that. But till then, I'd like you to keep in mind the 3 tenets. Represent folk horror at its best, and remind your readers of these 3 essential things. Number 1, the other is us. Number 2, the past never dies. And number 3, the land remembers.